We will begin our presentation shortly.
And Juris, Hira. You're on mute.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's special presentation of the Freedom to Vote Act, America's next great civil rights bill. My name is Therese Grant, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Iowa. Tonight's co-sponsors are also Des Moines NAACP, Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, the Links Incorporated Des Moines branch, the Metro Des Moines League of Women Voters, as well as our other special partners. We are so thrilled tonight to have Elizabeth Hira as our special guest speaker, and she's going to give us a much better understanding of the Freedom to Vote Act. This special piece of legislation is going to give Americans greater access to making voting free, fair, and accessible to all. It will also reduce the effect of money in politics, as well as reduce the effects of gerrymandering and so much more. Before I introduce Elizabeth, I want to share with you some information about her. Elizabeth Hira is a Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center Democracy Program, focusing on large-scale democracy reform. She is a passionate social justice advocate and has worked most recently in the U.S. Congress developing federal policy on equity with Senator Kamala Harris's legislative team, with a portfolio encompassing judicial nominations, gender equity, civil and LGBT rights, criminal justice, and immigration. At one time, she worked on behalf of our very own Senator Tom Harkin to ensure World Bank safeguard policies to protect people with disabilities. More recently, she served on the Committee on House Administration to develop the first version of H.R. 1, known as For the People Act, for the 116th Congress. Elizabeth holds a BA from Stanford University and earned her JD at Georgetown Law. And now it is my distinct honor to present tonight's special presenter, Elizabeth Hira.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Therese, and I could not be more happy to be with all of you. You stole a little bit of my thunder. I was going to reveal that I had worked for Senator Harkin, and he was my introduction to public service in the Senate. And I was so inspired by his leadership, by the bipartisanship that I know that he fostered, by his commitment to justice, that we always used to say in that office, you always have to think first of the people of the great state of Iowa. And so I still have that through my head whenever I do any sort of legislation. I was just thinking about the people of the great state of whatever, and now, thankfully, the people of the great state of the United States of America. So with that, I want to kick us off by acknowledging the reality that probably the reason that you have such an incredible attendance on this call is because people are incredibly afraid about what you've been hearing. And what you've probably been hearing all around this country is that in over 49 states, we have seen over 425 bills offered to suppress the vote. And we've seen many of those bills actually pass. And I think that that is rightfully giving a lot of people incredible cause for alarm. Now, part of the reason that I love giving these talks, the reason that I want to spend my evenings with you, and I'm always thrilled that you could be doing anything else but come to talk to me, is that I feel like one of the only people in America who likes to remind people that actually there is fantastic news. And I think it's our job, what I want to do with us here is to give you that great news. And that great news is, in spite of the voter suppression efforts that are happening all across this country, we do not have to fight 49 fights. We really have to fight one fight. And that fight is for these two amazing pieces of legislation that I'm going to be thrilled to talk to you about tonight. The first one is the Freedom to Vote Act. And that, together with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I promise you will beat back some of the worst and nastiest and ugliest efforts that we're seeing to suppress the vote. And exactly as Therese previewed, not only will they be protecting our right to vote, they're actually doing some really critical forward-looking work in America. So with that good news to sort of level set us for the tenor of the conversation that we're going to have today, and I'm really excited to give you this to do two things with you. First, to educate you about the content of the bill, because I know the NAACP and I know the League of Women Voters, and I know many of the incredible partners you have. What I know about your communities is that you are the most informed about what's happening on the ground. You are also ambassadors to other people. So my goal in this conversation is to really arm you with solid information, the real content, not the rhetoric, of what is in these bills, because I fundamentally believe, I'm a true believer on this, I think if you know what is in these transformative bills, you cannot help but celebrate them and spread the word in our communities. And what I have seen is that hope, that knowledge is a force multiplier, that power that comes from you being the ambassador to your communities for these bills is fundamentally what has kept this bill alive and what I think will change the next phase of what's possible in America. So that's actually what's getting me out of bed every day. So with that sort of introduction, I'm going to go ahead and start with what the content of this particular bill is, with the Freedom to Vote Act. And like I said, we're going to be building that content, getting toward the moment where we talk about why it matters in this moment. So this will take a little while, so feel free to take notes, but I think that we'll have the opportunity to share some resources with you as well. I have some handouts about what's in the bill, so you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. But I always say to people, the current bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, is 594 pages long. So to spare you from accidentally inducing a coma, I have tried to pull out the highlights that I really think are going to stick with folks. So the first one I like to share is this thing called automatic voter registration, which is already active in 19 states across the country, blue states and red states. And all automatic voter registration does is when you go to the DMV, which is already collecting your eligibility data, like your citizenship, because they're putting that on your driver's license, they would simply say, hey, Therese, would you like to opt in to register to vote? And Therese can say, I would not like to, and then she carries about her business. I hope that Therese would say, I would like to, and then she's registered to vote, and believe it or not, simple as that. The agency checks her eligibility the same way that they would for her license, and she's on her way. Now that simple innovation that, like I said, is already present in 19 states across the country, it could bring literally millions of American voters onto the rolls, which is something that really matters. It's a small fix with a really big impact. Additionally, another one like that is same-day voter registration, which again is already active in 20 states. Now for context, same-day voter registration is incredibly important because it has the power to bring communities that are already not centered in the vote to the table. What we know is that of those surveyed by some work that the Brennan Center did, we found that 11% of Black voters and 11% of Hispanic voters, respectively, reported that the single reason that they did not vote on election day was because they were not registered to vote. So if we had just given them the opportunity to safely and securely register to vote on the day of the election, which again, 20 American states are already doing, think about how many more people we could have had engaged in the process. Similarly, same-day voter registration is believed to be the single greatest intervention that could bring literally an increase of 10% of youth voters onto the rolls, right? And I also think this is really important for us to remember in the moment that we're in. What's really remarkable about right now, I believe in 2020 was the first year that, believe it or not, Gen Z, the youngest voters, and millennials together actually became a larger voting bloc than the boomers. So if young people in this country got together, they actually have power to dictate that agenda. And I share that piece of information with you because I think young people are not being told that. And they're not being told about the power that they have in their system. So I want to share that to say, when you talk to them, say, hey, if you guys got together, you could actually be setting the agenda. And that's part of what we would be doing with this bill. The bill also provides for 2 weeks of early voting, including on weekends and before and after work. Now, in the current paradigm, if you just have to vote on election day, you are stuck if for some reason you happen to get out of work late that day, right? Or as you know, one thing that I always raise, we talk a lot about these bills in terms of racial justice. I really like to lift up But there are so many dimensions of our identity that are implicated by things that you wouldn't even really think about. So early voting is my best example of that, and I'll tell you why. So early voting, what we know in the United States is that folks who have the least flexibility to take time off of work are often our hourly paid workers and our low wage workers. And guess what? We still live in a country where of the lowest paying jobs in the United States, those that pay under $10 an hour, 2/3 of those jobs are held by women. And what we also know is there's a thing that many of us are familiar with called the second shift, where when we get home, we're probably rushing to cook dinner. We may be packing lunch for the morning. We're rushing to get the kids out of the door in the morning. All of that together means there's this extra burden on us as women who have less flexibility because we have less economic power. And that means that we might miss the bus coming out of work that day because we had so much stuff on our plate. You guys all know what that experience is like. And because of that, you lose your opportunity to vote because it was one Tuesday. So Raise Up Early Voting is this amazing opportunity that, again, is a benign, neutral reform that ends up having this incredible effect for a group of people who are left out of the system. And some might say it's by design, some might say it's by neglect, but the reality is we need more people to participate, and this is a simple and effective way to do that. The bill would also just allow for an election day holiday, which I know so many of us think is just a common sense thing, right? And it would, I really love this as a new development in the bill. They really thought of everything. There's a new piece of the bill such that actually at naturalization ceremonies, they'll be handing out voter registration information. So when people take on that wonderful opportunity to become new Americans, they are immediately exposed to that sacred obligation and that privilege that we have to be able to vote. The bill also allows for the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. So when your little one goes to get her driver's permit at the DMV, even though she's not 18, she can say, I would like to pre-register so that she is automatically on the rolls when she turns 18. She doesn't have to worry about it, which again would really expand access for young people in the franchise. The bill also expands and reauthorizes grant programs to assure that people with disabilities have the same access to vote as people without disabilities. And really, really an important point to drive home, this bill is not a bunch of mandates without support. There is money in the bill to make sure that states can actually be in compliance with all of the things that we're demanding. I always say this is just setting a federal floor so that states can't play whack-a-mole with your voting rights, but they also have the resources they need to make sure that you have as much access as you need. The bill also, this is an important distinction that some of you probably have been following as the bill has evolved over time. The bill does not create a requirement to have voter ID in states that have not had voter ID. However, for the states that do have voter ID, it does some really important things, again, to standardize that right. I have some really ugly stories, particularly looking at communities like the Native American community, where voter ID restrictions were actually knowingly being added into the law with the intention or with the knowledge that they would disenfranchise certain communities, right? The example I'll give this to you because I think it's a story that sticks with me and hurts my heart. When North Dakota was considering its voter ID law initially, one of the actual officials from the government stood up as the legislature was considering its actions and said, you guys are asking for IDs that have a residential address on them, that only IDs that have residential addresses will be accepted. Now that sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing, but I need you all to know that that action will disenfranchise many Native American voters who live on reservations because guess what? The state does not assign addresses to every voter who lives on a reservation. So off the bat, many Native American voters didn't even have the opportunity to get the right ID. And I had the privilege when I was working in Congress on the House side of working with then Representative Marcia Fudge, who she traveled around the country collecting stories about this voter suppression. And I was in Standing Rock to hear a Native American advocate sit there and say, you guys are charging us $10 for these IDs. And because we're, again, working with some of the most impoverished communities in this country because of what that marginalization has wrought on these communities, she said, you're asking a family on the res for $10, and what that $10 is doing is forcing them to choose between a voter ID to access their right to vote or buying bread and milk for their family for the week. That is not a fair choice that any American should have to face, certainly not people who belong in the polity as much as the rest of us. And so this bill, really importantly, would make it so that that sort of situation that we were talking about would not actually be applicable. If you are a voter ID state already, like I said, no new imposition of requirements for non-voter ID states. If you're already a voter ID state, you better make sure that everybody has access to ID. And the things that are different about what this bill does is changes what is permissible to use as a form of ID. So now you can use your utility bill or your hunting and fishing license. And really, I think this is sort of wonderful for communities that lack ID. The bill also requires, if you're going to demand that folks have an ID to be able to vote, you as the state have to pay for that ID and make sure that people have it, right? So if you're going to create that demand, you actually have to give that benefit to people as well. And even if you lack the proper ID, it also still maintains these workarounds where you can have someone who knows you come and attest to your identity. So you make a sworn written statement under oath that you are who you are so that you don't lose the right to vote because you don't happen to have the right ID. It also allows for no excuse voting by mail, which again, during the pandemic, we saw how critical that was. We know that vote by mail is incredibly safe and incredibly secure. And we still think alongside all the other options that exist, vote by mail, there's no reason that we shouldn't have access to it. And we saw how critical it was in the last election as well. The bill would also provide for secured drop boxes. And like we were talking about, for workers who don't have economic flexibility, who maybe are working different hours than bank hours, the opportunity to go safely drop your ballot off at any time. You know, if you're working the graveyard shift, you should still be able to vote. And that would be provided by these secure drop boxes that, again, were used safely and securely in the last election. The bill would prohibit states from restricting curbside voting. And we all know that, again, during the pandemic, many of us learned that we could vote safely and securely from our car without having to go interact with people inside in this dangerous situation. So I always joke that at this point, I almost feel like Dr. Seuss, where I'm saying you can vote in a drop box, you can vote in your car, you can vote in your socks, you can vote with a hat, you can vote any way that you want that is safe and secure and already really tested by this bill. So that's part of why I feel like it's such great news. This is one of my favorite parts of the bill. It's about democracy restoration. And what that means is that people who are formerly incarcerated, once they are back and living in their community, there's no red tape, there's no strings. You are a citizen in the community, you are voting. And you don't have to live under the fear that someone is going to come prosecute you like they did to that woman, Crystal Mason, in Texas, right? The idea is you are in your community, you get to vote. And we all know that there are really ugly racial elements of mass incarceration. And so what this means is this simple change in the law would restore the vote to 3.9 million Americans, 1.6 of whom are Black and Latino. The bill also saves eligible voters from voter purging, which we know is ugly stuff that I'm sure you guys have heard about in Ohio and other places. Again, people of color are disproportionately affected by things like that because we're more likely to have common surnames, or they'll say you're missing a hyphen and we're going to throw out your vote. This bill would say, look, there needs to be verification, and what we're not going to do is throw you out for minor problems that don't actually affect your eligibility to vote. So it's just really common sense in that way. This is really important because of the climate that we're in. What you guys know is sort of how fraught it was to vote in this last election. And this bill would just prohibit interfering with people who are trying to register to vote or trying to vote. And it prevents, this is really important again for the climate that we're in, it actively responds to some of the ugliest things that we saw in the last election. So it has specific provisions to prevent election subversion. And it puts restrictions on the removal of election officials. So there's a really high threshold. You have to show active malfeasance before you're able to just say, you know what, I don't like how these people voted, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the election official who counts their votes. That would be absolutely barred by this bill. And really importantly, it increases protection for election workers. I'm sure you guys have seen, you know, it's people like you all who are volunteering at the polls and election workers who are the good people who day in and day out are doing the work to make our democracy function. And we've seen literal death threats against them and their families. The Brennan Center has this really frightening but very good piece about how some people are just coming out of election administration entirely because they're afraid for the safety and security of their families because of how much they're being gone after. And this bill would say this is not the climate. You should not be under threat because you are helping our democracy, and this would stop that. So it prohibits that voter intimidation, it protects elections workers from harassment, and it also just makes sure that there is security and integrity in that entire process so that you can do things like get financial support as a state to make sure that folks have paper ballots so that you as a voter know that your vote was cast and that it was counted as it was cast, right? There is actual financial support to make sure that election integrity and election security are protected. And there I'll pause to just point out the reason that's being offered for all of these voter suppressive bills is what we all identify as the big lie, which is just that, a big lie. And so the two facts that I want to ground that thought in real quick for you is that there are two things for you to know about this last election. Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security reported that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. So the big lie is just that, a lie. His own DHS reported that. The thing that I think is actually driving these bills, and I think the second most operative fact here, is that this last election also had the highest turnout that we have seen in over 120 years in America. That right now, Americans are more motivated than ever to participate in our democratic experiment. And I think that is what some people are afraid of. I think that's what's driving these bills. And that's why it's so important for us to have these conversations to say, nope, our elections are secure, our votes are secure, there is integrity in this process, and we need to protect that process and move forward. And, so that's some of the big picture stuff, but some of again, this bill responds to the scary moment that we're in. You guys, I'm sure, were aware in Georgia, we were seeing crazy things like lines for 10 hours for folks to be able to vote. And then in response to that, even watching that happen, the Georgia legislature had the nerve, frankly, to pass a bill that banned people from being able to get water and snacks if they're in line. Now, what is the takeaway supposed to be from that, except that you're going to ask me to stand in line for 10 hours, but I can't give, my elderly mom a glass of water while she's standing? I don't know what I take away from that, except that you don't want people to vote, right? And so the great news is this bill, it covers those tiny nuts and bolts too. So it says you absolutely can give water and snacks to people who are standing in line. But again, the big picture great news is because of this bill, you're never going to see a 10-hour line again. The bill, again, provides resources to states to limit lines to 30 minutes. And like I said, part of why you're also never going to see a 10-hour line is because you can be voting by mail, you can be voting early, you can be voting in all of these different and accessible ways that just give eligible Americans access to the franchise in a way that just finally makes sense. So like I said, that's sort of the nitty-gritty stuff of making sure that snacks are available and that lines are 30 minutes. But that leads me to some of the really big picture stuff that I know are big ticket items that we'll probably talk a lot more about as we get into conversation. One of them that is so crucial right now is just banning partisan gerrymandering. So right now, racial gerrymandering is already banned, but partisan gerrymandering often is just sort of used as another way to cut up districts and slice and dice the maps so that politicians get to choose their voters instead of voters getting to choose their politicians, which is the way it should be. So this bill would establish clear and neutral standards for congressional redistricting. I was sort of shocked to learn when I started this work that right now there are no rules. So literally, like one of my colleagues, Michael Lee, pulled up an example, I believe in 2011 in Pennsylvania, where a map was offered that morning. It was voted on in the committee. It was discussed without community intervention. And then I think it was passed that same night. That sort of crazy stuff does not really seem like you're prioritizing how voters actually feel in your community. And that would be stopped by this bill. So in addition to those clear and neutral standards for congressional redistricting, it would strengthen protections for communities of color and set up judicial remedies. So if a map looks fishy, you can move it and have it expedited through the process so that the bad faith map drawers can't just run out the clock and say, well, that's the map, so that's how we're voting. And it can be quickly challenged in court and fixed, which I think is amazing. And I think I want folks to also understand that there are so many communities. We talk again about sort of partisan gerrymandering that sometimes falls along racial lines. Part of what this bill acknowledges is that, again, we have many axes of our identity. And so there are communities of interest that are protected in this model. And those communities may be that you share a race or ethnicity, you may share a language, you may share a water table, right? We're broadly acknowledging that different communities have different interests and those interests should be kept together. And so that finally brings me to what I like to save as the best for last, my very favorite part of the bill, which is overhauling, hold on to your hats, overhauling campaign finance reform, which probably makes most people's eyes glaze over. And it certainly used to make my eyes glaze over too, because I was just like, oh, money in politics, what does that even mean? Of course there's money in politics. Well, no. The more that I've done this work, the more that I've realized what I think is revolutionary about the campaign finance pieces of this bill is it is the first time in my many years of doing this now that I've seen a bill actually ask the question, what infrastructural changes do we need to make so that American democracy reflects the people who live in America? That's all it is. So I think to contextualize that, I think I want to give you one thing that if there's one soundbite that you take away from today, this is it. So we're in the 117th Congress, and that Congress is the most diverse Congress we have ever seen in American history, which sounds like it's worth celebrating, right? That most diverse Congress in American history, it is 77% white, it is 74% male, and in a survey of the Congress before it, which was to date then the most diverse Congress, we learned that fewer than 5% of people in Congress reported ever working a blue-collar job. Combine that with the fact that currently about 2/3 of the Senate are millionaires. In the history of Congress, 10 people have given birth while serving in office. And the structures were so not designed for us that, again, I know that there are a lot of women on this call. 2011 was the first year that women serving in the House of Representatives got their own bathroom on the House floor. Prior to that, they had to walk away from the floor to go use the public restrooms, which meant you get to choose between getting to go to the ladies' room or missing your vote, right? That is how much these structures were not designed for us, right? Never mind, I just learned this, and I also thought it was shocking. There is currently one immigrant in the entire United States Senate, Mazie Hirono, right? You think about how pressing these issues are for so many people. And so I raised those statistics, not because I just want to say, oh, well, guys, diversity is important for diversity's sake. I raised those statistics because once I put them all together for this paper that I wrote for the Brennan Center, I realized something that was really important. And what I realized was who gets a seat at the table dictates what policies get lifted up. So if what you're seeing is that Congress is barely 1 in 4 women, but 2/3 of the Senate are millionaires, suddenly it makes sense that we're talking about the estate tax a lot more than we're talking about universal health or childcare, right? And it suddenly makes sense that we don't have things like paid family leave, right? Because those are the things that actually matter to everyday Americans, right? So when we talk about this bill, I just want to drive home that we are not just talking about the freedom to vote. And I also like to really reiterate, the freedom to vote, regardless of the color of your skin in this country, is a question that should have been settled since 1965. So if there's something that makes my blood boil, it's that we're still having that conversation to this date. That is a dated conversation, and the question has been answered. Yes, every eligible American should have access fairly and freely to the franchise. But that is what I love about this bill, is the second part of this bill is looking forward. It's not just saying, how do we fix the things that are wrong or beat back the worst efforts at repression? It's actually saying, what if for the first time we created an inclusive democracy that reflected the American people? And part of why I find that message inspiring is because I think that would be the answer to transcending so much of the polemical partisanship that we're talking about. It's really hard to care more about the culture wars than care about if your kids are getting clean food and water. I always remind people, right now we're living in a country where the latest stats I saw is that 1 in 7 American children are going hungry. In one of the richest countries in the world, we have no excuse for why we're not getting things done. But when I started looking at who gets seats at the table, I understood why problems like that were not getting lifted up. And so to explain the public finance reforms that I was saying to you are so important, simple little fixes. Like, so now the bill would say, if the Secretary of State chooses, that Secretary of State can avail themselves of a fund, a special fund that would allow for this to happen. If, Victoria wants to run for office and I'm an everyday American, I don't make a lot of money, but I really believe in her, and I don't think she should have to be a millionaire to run, I can put $1 in toward Victoria. And then there's a special fund that's created by the Freedom to Vote Act that would actually give, for my $1, they would donate 6. And that simple change would not take anybody out of the running who was previously eligible, but it would vastly diversify who got to run. And what's really important, I can't emphasize this enough, there is not a cent of taxpayer dollars. No, there's not a cent of taxpayer money in that fund. That entire fund is filled with penalties from corporate lawbreakers. So these corporations who have been currently running the country, the billionaires who are controlling our elections, would lose frankly, the change that they're finding on their private jets, then funds this thing that lets everyday Americans come to the table, right? So that you don't have to be a millionaire to run. And this is another, it's just a sort of mind-blowing thing that I was really privileged, part of the bill that I got to write, that later was picked up, I'll tell you by who, addresses a really simple problem that is another example of a structural problem to me. And that is, if you're a candidate running for office, well, first of all, on average, women have to be told 7 times that they should run before they take it seriously. And even knowing that, so which is what I want to say to every single one of you on this call, tell every woman that you know that she should run, and tell her 8 times, right? But on top of that, what was crazy to me is that there was a survey by the Center for American Women in Politics of successful state legislators who had won their seats. And those women reported they had been actively discouraged by their party apparatus from running. So we're still facing this wall about other people telling us who's electable and who's not, right? And the reality is that as a result, it meant in the 2018 congressional cycle, Black female congressional candidates raised a third of what their female counterparts raised. Never mind what men did, right? That's what we're being told, is this picture of who's electable fundamentally changes who even gets to run, right? Oh, and what I was getting to, right, is this thing, suppose you go through all those hurdles and you decide that you do want to run. Well, guess what the status quo is that will also be changed by this bill? The status quo is if there's a campaign event and there is a male candidate, let's say, and he wants to go attend that campaign event, and he wants to rent a tuxedo, he can use his campaign funds to rent that tuxedo, no questions asked. That's a standard, that's always been done. But if you happen to be a parent candidate, a woman, let's say, and you want to use your campaign funds to go to that same event, you want to use your campaign funds to pay a babysitter for that same event, you have to ask for special permission from the FEC. Because the tuxedo makes sense for the campaign event, but you would have needed a babysitter anyway because you were a parent. That's another example of how these structures were created to not accommodate us. And that's this piece of the bill, the Help America Run Act, that's in the Freedom to Vote Act. It's really important that it's championed by this brilliant woman, Katie Porter. And part of the reason I think Katie Porter championed this bill is because, guess what? In the whole history of the United States Congress, Katie Porter is the first person to ever be a single parent of young children in Congress. So she knows what it means when you have to pay for a babysitter because you're not a millionaire. You don't have that cash lying around to be able to take a year off of your life and run a campaign without having things like your health insurance covered by your campaign funds. And again, there's all these protections. You still have a cap so that you can't abuse that system. But the idea is just we need these changes structurally to make sure that everyday Americans get a seat at the table. And besides Katie Porter, the other person who I love to lift up is these are not abstract concepts about what it means to have real people at the table. And the thing that always moves my heart is my latest and greatest example of this is that Cori Bush is the only person that I have certainly ever heard of. Of course, Katie Porter grew up in Iowa. Go, get on you, Iowa. I'm not surprised to hear that. Cori Bush is the only person who I've ever heard run for Congress who talks about the experience of having to live in her car with her two little babies. And that struck me when I heard it the first time. But you know what it really struck me? It struck me when I realized that Cori Bush was the only member of Congress willing to put her body on the line, to sleep on the steps of the Capitol, to stop so many American families from being evicted from their homes, because she has that lived experience, because that's part of what she has experienced. And so it matters to her that what people experience comes from their heart. And so it matters that people are not talking about you because they read about you in a book or in law school, they saw you were in a case study. It's because they had that experience themselves, right? That they are Lucy McBath who lost a child to gun violence. So she will be dedicated to that issue in a way that just nobody without that lived experience can be. So I raise all of that, and I'm sorry I always get emotional, but I want you to understand that that is what is at stake here. This is not about the bloodlessness of white marble buildings in Washington. This is about everyday Americans making sure that our kids are fed and that they're safe, that our water is clean, that our air is healthy, that the regular stuff we want to be just doing in the world gets to get done, because that should be the actual priority of our government. And so that's what I leave you with. What this bill is about, besides the freedom to vote, which again should be a foregone conclusion in 2021 in America, is really asking what would happen if our democracy really, really embraced and belonged to all of us as Americans. So your power tonight, your power to your community is not just protecting our right to vote. It is building a country for the first time that would truly deliver on the promise of embracing all of us as Americans. So I'm going to leave you with just sort of a personal anecdote before we get to the conversation that I'm really excited to have with you. And that is, I think like Juris mentioned, I had the incredible life experience of getting to work on this bill, the original version of it, the For the People Act, in the 116th Congress when it first came up. And I remember having just thoughts like, this is why I became a lawyer, right? These common sense, massive structural things that could have such big changes, with such big impact with such small changes, like asking the DMV to collect one more question, right? So we were working on this nonstop. Literally, we just got Christmas Day off. My poor mom was like, this had better be good because we're not seeing you. We didn't see you for Thanksgiving. And I remember the day that the bill passed. I was on the floor and I got to be there when John Lewis spoke for the bill. There's definitely footage of me crying on C-SPAN, which I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear after seeing how important this is to me. But I thought, okay, great. The world is going to change now. And so, you know, I get out of we passed the bill. I think there's going to be angels flying over the Capitol. And the next day, I eagerly opened the New York Times to see what they're said about this game-changing bill. And we barely, if I recall correctly, made page 4 of the news. That there was no, they don't even name the bill, right? They didn't talk about why it was important. They just sort of were like, Democrats have done something. Now, you could have tipped me over with a feather if you had told me that not only 2 or 3 years later, I'd be sitting here on a Zoom with people from the great state of Iowa talking about this bill. And the backdrop for this is that literally with the March on Washington that we just did, tens of thousands of Americans literally took to the streets with signs about this bill that 3 years ago couldn't have made page 4 in the Times. That is what the climate has changed. And I think what's really important for all of us to understand is this is not impossible, and it's not even partisan. That's part of, I'm sure you guys saw this great piece that Jane Mayer did on the New Yorker. That was a really sort of big whistleblowing piece to me, because what it revealed is that Republican voters are also in favor of what's in this bill. They don't want billionaires running elections. Democratic voters, independent voters. This is a bipartisan supported bill. The only people who don't like this bill are the Republican leaders who stand to lose a lot from it. And so I'm sure we're going to talk in our conversation about how we can actually get this passed. But I want you all to remember, and there's a great pollster who always says it, the opposition to this bill is not opposition. The opposition to this bill is cynicism. So they want you to feel like you are powerless. They want you to fixate on those 425 bills moving in 49 states. They don't want you to know what we just know, what we learned together today. There is one fight and that you are part of it. And that your voice, literally these conversations that I've been having nonstop for months now, are the reason that this bill is still alive and on the table. And I firmly believe they're the reason it's going to get it passed in the next couple of months. So we will fundamentally transform America. So with that, I'm thrilled to have had this opportunity to share all of that with you. And I just can't wait to celebrate it together when we do it. So let's pivot to questions. And I guess my big sign off for you is like, how lucky that we are so powerful and that we get to do this together, that we get to say there's a new dawn in America because of what we all have done here together. So thanks so much. And I'll kick it back to you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think the question that was just dropped in the chat is probably the best question for us to start with. And that question comes from a very active, engaged individual with voting. His question is, in the past 2 weeks, both the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act have been filibustered by Senate Republicans. Can they still be brought up? What's the future of the bills? Essentially, where is this now and how can we move it forward?
I'm so glad for the question because it's actually a really important one. It's actually emblematic of the thing I was just talking about where people want you to feel hopeless. So the media keeps inaccurately talking about how when these votes happen, the bill dies. Now, clearly the bill's not dead because we've been talking about the bill for this entire period, right? So I just want to explain like some simple things that I think will help suss out what's going on here. First, the media is inaccurate on this point, which I can say as a former congressional staffer. I wish they paid more attention to procedure, but there are a couple things that are happening. One is that whenever you have a vote on a bill, it's not just a vote on the merits of the bill. First, you vote to open debate on the bill. And that's where this thing called the filibuster comes in, right? So basically the status quo is that you can continue to debate the bill indefinitely until 60 of 100 senators get together and say, we're going to end the debate on this bill. And we're going to move on to the second vote, which is the vote on the merits. The vote on the merits doesn't need 60 people. It just needs 51 people for a bill to pass. But we want to preserve the opportunity for debate, right? Because we assume that that debate is going to be happening in good faith. Now, here's the thing that I wish was covered more that is just a trick about Senate procedure. I think I call it a loophole because it's not even really changing the rules. Literally all you need to do to change this practice that we call the filibuster, this gentleman's agreement that 60 people will say that's enough debate, let's move on to the merits. All you need is 50 senators and the tie-breaking vote of the vice president to get together and say, okay, we've talked about this enough. The filibuster is, we're not going to get 60 votes, but that's not the end of the road. Those 50 people plus the tie-breaking vote of the vice president can just get together and change the rules. It's not even a formal change of the rules because the filibuster doesn't come from somewhere. It's not from the Constitution. It's a practice, right? So those 50 people, if they look at what's happening, if they look at the gridlock, the line of bills that are stuck because of the filibuster, we need them to decide, hey, these bills need to move. So the 50 of us plus the VP need to get together and just say that's the end of the filibuster. So we talk about it like we just say fix or nix the filibuster, which 51 of them can do. And again, the reason I'm really hopeful about this is you guys probably followed this. One of the biggest challenges to the Freedom to Vote Act was at that point, West Virginia Senator Manchin, who said that he wouldn't support it. Now, and wrote a whole op-ed, which again caused the press to gleefully trip over themselves about how dead democracy was in America, right? Except, and I always say, in Washington, I was there long enough to know that I don't watch what they say, I watch what they do. And what Joe Manchin did is he became a leader, a signature leader on the bill that we're now talking about tonight. So he went from one of the people who was most opposed to it to actually being the one. Failure or success at this bill lands at his feet. He has skin in the game in a way that he has never had before, which if I were watching this, I would say, great, we are in a better position than we've ever been. So we just need to hit a point, and that's part of what our advocacy is tonight, is we need to be flooding the offices of the people who haven't come out and said we need to reform the filibuster with a request for them to just do it so we can get democracy done. It's not, again, you don't need to amend the Constitution. You literally just get 50 senators together with one tie-breaking vote of the VP, who obviously has said she's in support of this bill. And then you can change the rules. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's not magic. And they want you to, they report on it and they do all this stuff to make it seem like it's really complicated. It's really not. It's 50 people saying enough is enough. They get together, the rules are changed, and then you get to vote on the bill on its merits. And if 51 of them vote on the bill on its merits, all of that change comes to America. So I would be incredibly hopeful.
Awesome, thank you. I think the next question you touched on in your closing, in registration, this question was asked many different ways, but it's essentially the same question. And that is, how do we get this passed? How do we really get this passed with the clear Republican opposition? And are you aware of any specific work being done with senators, the Republican senators specifically, to change, I guess, their minds for the bipartisan support that would be necessary?
So the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. I take no stance on the parties. I take a stance on the democracy reform bill that we're looking at. And I really want people to understand that at the end of the day, the Senate is just a numbers game. So like I said, you need 51 people to change the rules to end the filibuster. You need 51 people to pass to vote the bill. It just so happens that the party who supports the bill, including the vice president, is exactly 51 people at their disposal. So there's no reason for us to be worried about whether or not we can bring over people who have consistently been opposed to this bill. We don't need to bring them. We certainly don't need to bring 10. We theoretically don't even need to bring 2. We have enough people, which means that this is the pressure point. This is the reason that I think it's worth it for us to be having this conversation. What we need to do as people who support this bill, regardless of party, is to convince those 51 people that they need to fix or nix the filibuster and pass the bill. And the only way they're going to do that is if they hear from you constantly. So if I had concrete tips, right? People always say, call your senator. If you live, I grew up in Connecticut. It's not going to help for me to call my wonderful senators because they're already very supportive. And if I call West Virginia, it's not going to be as powerful as if I were a West Virginia voter. So there are brilliant advocates who come up with awesome stuff that actually will get us over the line. So a couple of them that I'll mention are friends at the Declaration for American Democracy. And actually, I can share these with you guys in a Twitter thread because I put them together. Our friends at Declaration for American Democracy have put together a tool where you can amplify your voice by writing a letter to the editor in the place that you are. Because remember, politicians care about their local coverage far more than they care about what's happening in the Washington Post. And you guys in Iowa are at a specific advantage. The one thing I always tell people to do, one of the only silver linings of pandemic is that I'm sitting in my apartment here in Brooklyn talking to you all in Des Moines. And there's no reason that you couldn't have a town hall and say, Senator Grassley, we would like to talk to you about what this nonpartisan voter advocate just told us is in this bill. And we would like you to explain to us why you don't support this bill with your words while you're present. And guess what? If he doesn't happen to show up to that town hall, that's as powerful a story as him showing up and defending himself. Because you can say, I'm sorry, you're running again for the United States Senate and you couldn't bother to find 20 minutes to flip open your computer to come talk to your constituents about this thing that literally could bring millions of Americans onto the voter rolls? It's poppycock. And so I think that there is an opportunity there. You're organizing through town halls, Zoom town halls, you write letters to the editor, and then you do things like use this tool that our friends at Common Cause have developed to get those 50 people to cross that line. Like I said, I'm not a West Virginia voter, so my call doesn't matter to the Senate as much as they call the West Virginians. So what you can do as an interested Iowan is use this tool from Common Cause and pick up the phone and talk to a West Virginia voter and say, hey, this nonpartisan voting advocate from the Brennan Center just taught me what's in this bill. I need you to understand why it's important. Your phone call matters. So you recruit other Americans. We create a power multiplying effect, right? So it's your town halls, it's your letters to the editor, it's your op-eds. Your all voices are powerful. As the NAACP, as the League of Women Voters, as soror girls, all of you guys are so powerful with these voices that you have. And if you organize together, think about that as a power amplification rather than you just making one phone call one day, right? So I share all of those as concrete ways to do it, but really the single most effective thing that you can do is to flood the zone and not stop the conversation, to always be talking about this, right? So anytime someone says, oh my God, this voter suppression stuff is crazy, I need you to say, you know what's actually crazy? That there's one bill in Congress that has already passed a chamber of Congress and it's like 2 people away from becoming law. So when people try to get you to be stressed out about how hopeless it is, I want you to flip that paradigm and say, we're 98% of the way there. When I joined Senator Harris's office, I was then Senator Harris's office, I was told that on average, it took 8 years for a piece of legislation to go from ideation to passage. That puts in perspective how amazing it is. This bill, while again, it's been being worked on for years, it was put together, it is now ready to go. It is ready to answer this moment. It's passed the Chamber of Congress. The President of the United States and the Vice President have publicly spoken out in support of it and said we want it to come to our desk. So we're ready. We just need to do that final work to get those 2 or 3 people over. And it's not even like they need to change their mind from being Republicans, right, who don't support the bill. All we need to do is get them to say, you guys support the content of this bill. Can you please change this minor procedural thing called the filibuster so we can get on about the business of governing? Just do not let people who want to lie to you with cynicism trick you into believing you have power on this. We really are very, very close. And if you continue to flood the zone, you never let them rest, they have to do something. And the evidence of that is, again, the fact that we've been talking about this bill since 2019, right? And that we are now, like I said to you, that climate that we're in is so different that you have Michelle Obama is talking about the bill, right? That it's so powerful that even Mike Pence wants to say how much he hates it, right? Or that Mitch McConnell would spend his own time and sit for hours in hearings on the bill, which is very unusual. That's how close we are, right? That they're scared. And I think what they're doing is pushing back on those of us who would support democracy. And we're almost there.
So you sound so hopeful that it seems like it should be this very easy thing to do. And I know you've touched on it a bit already, but as you've been talking, we still had a few people that have followed up with, if it really is this easy, why isn't this just done? And I would like to add to that question that if there is some specific things or specific people, which you've already addressed, there's a few people, what can we in Iowa do? We already know that our representatives in this process don't support, and changing their mind. Of course, we can work on them, but who else might we be able to help outside of Iowa, or how might we be able to help them?
So I strongly encourage you to look at those calling tools for Common Cause, because if you as a citizen speaking to another citizen, you're not a lobbyist, you're not some paid advocate, you're another citizen who just says, hey, this is important to me. That actually seems to have a lot of sway with folks. That's a very concrete thing you can do. But the other thing, like I was saying, is that you need to keep beating this into the national conversation. Even if your senators haven't said that it's a priority, how embarrassing is it? Because somebody sent me a form letter the other day from Nebraska that was just like, here's why we don't support this federal overreach. And part of what I do on these calls, and you guys know you can always reach out to me for this, is explain to you why that's a totally specious argument. It's not a good argument. And then you can write back and write those arguments in an op-ed and say, we need actual answers from you, because we're not getting them. We're getting form letters about stuff. So I think continuing, even if you don't think you're going to move those people, what you need to do is keep making it clear that this bill has bipartisan support, that it's common sense, that it contains features that are already in place all over red and blue states. And I know, to the point of if it were easy, it'd be done already. Well, good Lord, there are a lot of things that if they were easy, they would be done, but it's still worth fighting for them. And I always like to remind people, and particularly as people who have been, I'm marginalized, I'm an immigrant woman of color raised by a single mom in a working class family. If I gave up every time somebody told me that I ought to give up because it'd be hard, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you right now. But there are people who are reliant on people like me giving up, right? There are people who are reliant on walking into a room and seeing me on the Senate side, on the House side, and saying, she has the audacity to think that she should get to be as American as the rest of us? Yeah, I do. And so should all of you. So them telling you that it's hard, what they hope is that you're going to give up. Because if there's one thing I can guarantee you, is that this bill absolutely will fail if you do nothing. Which is why there are so many people working so hard to get you to feel hopeless and do nothing. And I can't guarantee you that we're going to pass it in November or December or even January. But I can guarantee you that it's a hell of a lot more likely that it's going to pass if we keep raising hell about it, which is what we're doing. It's what we have not let up about. So they would have had us believe that this thing was over in summer when Joe Manchin wrote that op-ed. And instead, Dr. King's children organized a march on Washington, organized 5 different places where voter suppression was the hottest, got people out in the streets in Georgia and said, absolutely not on our watch. But I think that's the momentum. That's not just me. I'm not just Pollyanna-ishly optimistic for my own sake. I'm really not, because I don't have time to waste, right? Like, what I am watching is these conversations literally changing, frankly, creating a climate of embarrassment for people who don't want to participate. And I can tell you the concrete results of that have been that in the last couple of days, Angus King, who is an independent, has made very clear that he's coming out for the filibuster. That Senator Carper from Delaware, again, people who are not radicals, are coming out and saying, the democracy is not happening because of this filibuster. It's a simple thing, we can fix it. And that is momentum that I need you to watch. So I think I just feel like there's a lot of Chicken Little happening where people aren't paying attention to the facts, where they sort of freak out and go, it's hard, it's bad. If it were easy, it'd be done. Well, no, look at what's actually happening. You have the guy who was the biggest opposition suddenly becoming the biggest leader. And you have these people who are by no means radical fringes of the Democratic Party saying, okay, enough is enough. We got to move on this, guys. So those are the facts that I look to, right? That's what I was saying. The Brennan Center relies on facts. We don't rely on rhetoric or ambient energy. So when you read the facts in the room, the tea leaves are pretty good on our side. But the only way that that works is if you keep up doing what you've been doing.
So your last statement there just leads into one of the other questions that has been asked. And besides the Brennan Center, who would you recommend, or what organizations would you recommend being accurate sources of up-to-date information so that we don't get caught up or discouraged in the way that you've mentioned?
So like I said, the Brennan Center, I really, I work here because I believe in us. Common Cause, if there's one person that so obviously I always keep up on this on Twitter, so you guys are welcome to follow me at Elizabeth Hira on Twitter. But there's one person who I love, my friend Steve Spalding, who also used to be my seatmate in the House, who also helped to write this bill. Steve Spalding is at Common Cause. He does incredible, really simple explanations of what's happening there. I'll put his stuff in the I can do it there. At Stephen Spalding at Common Cause. Public Citizen is another group of friends who are doing great work. And again, I really want to emphasize that we have different people at the table than I've ever seen. Sierra Club, who cares for the environment, is one of the leaders in our movement. You guys know better than anybody. League of Women Voters is right there. The Legal Defense Fund is there. All of us have different angles that we take on this stuff. So part of what Brennan does, it's funny, it's a little joke inside of our community because we can't tell if it's really a compliment or maybe an insult. That Reverend Barber once said to us that the Brennan Center, we are the footnotes of the movement. So I like to think it's a compliment because I think every movement needs footnotes. Every movement needs facts, right? In fact, our facts inform that policy. But our friends at Common Cause, at Public Citizen, at League of Women Voters, you guys are doing, again, nonpartisan, non-rhetorical work as well. So if you ever need footnotes, and again, I hope that we get will you guys send up a follow-up email so that I can share? Actually,
Yes, we will be sending out to all the participants tonight. Anybody who has registered but wasn't able to make it, they'll have a link to the video as well as any outgoing materials we'd like to give to them.
So I can include in that, there's this paper that I spent 8 months of my life working on when I first got to the Brennan Center that really lays out a lot of the parts of what was then before the People Act, but now many of them are in the Freedom to Vote Act, that really just have those footnotes so that people can't say, oh, you're just being rhetorical, right? Like Ted Cruz was, I think, speaking to a voter rights advocate, and he was like, well, what's racist about this thing? And it's like, well, okay, if you're not paying attention to the impacts, then I can see why you're making an argument that's rhetorical, but what you need is the data. And that's what the Brennan Center is giving you. It's what Common Cause is definitely giving you as well. Our friends at Demos, they focus on people of color as well, and that angle. Does that feel like it answered your question?
Yeah, I think that's a great start. There's some definite places there that we haven't heard of before, so that's helpful.
And one place that actually would be very, very helpful, because again, every community has skin in this game. The environmentalists, folks with disabilities, young people. So there's this group that's the coalition of all of us, is called the Declaration for American Democracy, DFAD. That's the coalition that includes everybody. So if you just go and look at the members in DFAD for whatever thing you care about, your issue, you know, whether it's disability voting or the environment or whatever, you can find the group that you should probably tune into. But for sort of big picture stuff, I'd say us and Common Cause are probably the two that I always come to mind. For context, if I don't know something, I call Steve. So you're getting my inside line with those sorts of things. And he is often more accurate. Like I was saying, the media will often misrepresent things, and he's really good at just saying, nope, that's wrong, and here's why. So if you want sort of up to the minute accurate stuff, that's where I would go.
Okay, awesome. That's so helpful. I think the last question that we'll have for the evening probably should have been asked a little bit ago, but I think it's too important for everybody to understand so misinformation doesn't cause extra confusion. But the question is about, you mentioned that the bill provides the funding to do all of the things that it says it wants to be able to do. And so the question is about that funding and who controls that fund, how to determine how it's being distributed properly, and is there any checks and balances, I suppose, associated with that are listed in the bill already?
So the federal government already has this mechanism called the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, and there's all this funding that goes to support the states in doing the work of elections, right? So I think it's important for folks to understand there are over 10,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. And a lot of those, like we said, are local election officials that are trying to do their job. There is a part of the Constitution called the Elections Clause that also says that the federal government, the Congress, also has control over federal elections, over the time, place, and manner. And so that is the constitutional hook that we're using for this entire argument. And there, again, there's a lot of standard for us giving support through things like the EAC, which you can definitely look up, that actually is infrastructural support for state election officials to do their job. So like, you know, for instance, they'll do stuff like the state will submit like, okay, I would like, there was an old part of the bill that I think has been stricken since the original version, but like, you could get extra money for your state if you recruited poll workers at the local secondary school, right? And so like this, in that infrastructure, the election official in that state would say, hey, I saw this part of the bill on page 84. I would like to apply for that grant under the EAC, and then they would get support through the EAC to administer those funds. But that's not a change from the Freedom to Vote Act. That's always been how this has worked, that you have some state control, some federal control, the opportunity under the Constitution for the Congress to control its federal elections, and then support for the states to do their good work in the way that makes sense for them, in tandem with election officials, many of whom were consulted in the construction of this bill. Actually, and that's an important point, Senator Manchin, I believe, is a former Secretary of State of West Virginia. So a lot of his changes were driven by what he believed to be his experience as an election official himself. So there's definitely no room to say that we're not thinking about what state infrastructure actually looks like. We are supporting states and very much took into account a lot of stakeholders, including state election officials.
Awesome. Wow, that is just so much good information. Elizabeth, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I just wanted to check before I do and see, is there anything else, any final parting words for us that you might have?
I think watching this happen I cannot emphasize enough the point that we sort of brought home, which is that the only way that this works is if we keep doing this, if we keep the message constant. And look, there are over 100 of you just sitting on this with me right now, never mind how many folks are on Facebook, right? That you're doing this on, I don't even remember what day it is, it's Tuesday, it's pandemic day, right? That you could be doing anything else and instead you're doing this. And what I hope is that we've spent this time together so you are now equipped to go tell the story to everybody who will listen to you, and that you tell them that they have reason to be hopeful. And so I think if there is, and not only reason to be hopeful, but concrete action items, like we said, right? Like, I need you to go call other citizens across America. The one thing, and I tell my poor mother this, I always worry about her blood pressure. It's like, the one thing I don't need you to do is stay at home and spin up your blood pressure with MSNBC. If you get on the phone or CNN or any of our friends that like to yell, or Fox News or whoever, get on the phone and talk to other Americans. Get on the phone and Victoria calls Therese and Therese says, I'm going to mobilize an event. Watch what these folks are doing, plug into your local grassroots networks. Because again, folks like somebody mentioned, Senator Sinema, there are veterans groups that get together to just say, hey, I went and fought for democracy in Iraq, Senator Sinema. When I voted for you, I thought you were going to fight for democracy in America, right? Those are actions that are happening on the ground that you all can plug into. And at a minimum, even if you don't have the time or the space to do that, you can keep talking to people like me and organize more events like this. So I literally have talked to, I think I was running the numbers today, probably 100,000 people, right? Just in these kinds of conversations, right? And that's amazing because that's the thing that keeps it on the table. So I think my parting message for you is think about how close we are, not how far we have to go, because we actually are quite close. And I also want you to appreciate how far we have come. Right? In this moment that we're having this conversation is, like I said, not only are more Americans than ever participating in American democracy, there was an actual attack on the physical infrastructure of the United States Capitol, because how powerful we are is frightening to some people who don't want us to go forward. So this is the moment that feels like it's the darkest, I genuinely believe, because we are before the dawn. But there are too many Americans of integrity and conscience who will look at themselves and say, this is not my country. And I always tell people, if you want people to vote for you, you shouldn't have to, or you want to win a seat, you shouldn't have to rig an election or suppress a vote to do it. What you should do is create policy that people get behind, and they'll show up for you. So when these folks come out here with these sort of cockamamie stories about why they don't support this bill, just say, Senator, I know that you wouldn't need to rig an election or suppress a vote. I know that if you don't believe your ideas are good enough to make Americans stand behind you, you should not be running for office. And when you are in those town halls asking those questions of your own senators, I would be really interested to hear what they say, because I think what you see, again, is people being polemical and yelling at them and not asking those questions. Why on earth wouldn't you want to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds to vote? What good reason do you have against that? Right? So I think always be specific and try to be less polemical if you can. I know in the climate that we're in, it's hard, but really, really, really don't give up hope, because this funny Zoom call that we're doing between Des Moines and Brooklyn is what democracy actually looks like. We're doing it together. And how beautiful a thing to hold on to your heart and be proud of yourselves for. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all tonight, to get to have a little moment in the great state of Iowa. I'm really grateful for it. I'm grateful for what we're going to get done together.
And we are super, super thankful for you being here, Elizabeth. Thank you for your time this evening. There's so much information that I know, at least for me, was it was helpful to have some clarity on. And I know that I'm probably gonna have 1,000 more questions once I'm able to kind of download and process and also review my notes. And so I know that you are going to share some information with us, and we will get that out to our viewers tonight. And so I just thank you for all the time and the work that you're doing on this, outside of just helping us have a better understanding. It's going to be so important for you, clearly, to continue the work, and we're just so thankful for your talent in this realm.
Just remember, the reason they want to take your vote away is because of how powerful your vote is.
That's how powerful it is.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
and
everyone.
I just dropped my email in the chat. So, I mean, you guys found me because someone reached out after another talk. I am happy to do this until the cows come home. Awesome. So you can always reach out, and I'm happy to share resources with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So everyone, my name is Victoria Henderson Weber. I am the president of the Des Moines branch of the NAACP. listening to Elizabeth tonight, what I heard her tell us is that the Freedom to Vote Act expands opportunities to vote. It thwarts voter suppression. It contains redistricting reform, prevents election sabotage, modernizes voting registration, contains campaign finance reform, promotes election security, and most importantly, has the funding and controls built in to make all of these things happen. And so I would encourage all of you to take this information. We are live on Facebook, share it with your friends so they can come back and watch it so that they can understand, like Elizabeth said at the beginning, what is actually here and not what is being speculated on or misconstrued. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And so on behalf of the Des Moines branch of the NAACP, the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, the Links, the League of Women Voters of Iowa, and the Metro Des Moines, the women in the NAACP, Ames branch of the NAACP, Black Women for Healthy Living, Children and Family First, Delta Sigma Theta sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, Zeta Phi Beta sorority, and the Tawassee Federated Women's Club. We thank you so much for joining us. Please look out for our follow-up email with the information that Elizabeth has shared with us tonight. And in a final piece of closing, thank you, big thank you to Betty Andrews, president of the Iowa-Nebraska State Conference of the NAACP, for providing tech support tonight. We greatly appreciate all of you and thank you so much for joining us.
I'm not sure if we're still live, so I just wanted to say thank you.
Like this, gotta be something for me to write this. I ain't seen you in a minute. Wrote this letter. I need to sign still for us to grow together. Love has no limit. Gonna slow forever. I know your heart is weathered by what just did to you. I ain't sorry because I probably did it too. Cause you feel as I handle with care. Some recognize your life, they can handle the glare. You know I ain't the type to walk around with matching shirts and relationships, but I will match your work. I want to be the one to make you happiest and hurt you the most. To say the end is there, it's important that we close to the most high. Second, it's important we communicate, tune the fate of this union to the right pitch. I never thought you so much more in you. You understand the union of woman and man. Sex and the where they assuming the land, but that's fly by night. When you in the sky, right? When these close my night moon, you my light. If heaven had a height, you would be that tall. Ghetto the coffee shop, I see that all. Let's stick to understanding and we won't fall. For better or worse times, I hope to me you call. So I pray every day more than anything. Prayers will stay as we begin to lay this foundation for a family. Love ain't simple. Why can't it be anything worth having you work at annually? Granted, we known each other for some time. It don't take a whole day to recognize sunshine. Kind of fresh, you listen to more than hip hop, and I can catch you in the mix from beauty to thrift shop. Plus, you ship out when it's time to. Thinking you fresh, suggesting beats I should rhyme to. At times when I'm lost, I try to find you. You know to give me space when it's time to. My heart's dictionary defines you. It's love and happiness. Truthfully, it's hard trying to practice happiness. The time we committed love, it was real good. Had to be for me to arrive, but it still feel good. I know the sex ain't gonna keep you, but as my equal, it's how I must treat you. As my reflection, the light, I'ma lead you. And whatever's right, I'ma feed you. I tell you the rest when I